Kari Lake discovered God guns in the GOP about 5 minutes before she decided to run for governor.
We have been ensnared in McCain-style politics for a generation, where the amazing people of this state have had no say.
The longest primary campaign Arizona has seen in decades, maybe ever, is almost over. Spending records have been smashed, a pig has squealed in an ad, and a drag queen played a starring role for a while there. Little humor before we break down a primary campaign that's put Arizona on the national stage, the latest stop in the Republican Party's uncivil war between Donald Trump and his election deniers on one side versus Mike Pence, Doug Ducey, and an establishment that wants to move on from 2020. Joining us to break it all down are Julie Erfle, a Democratic communications consultant at Erfle Uncuffed, and Paul Bentz, a Republican who is Senior Vice President for Research and Strategy at HighGround Consulting here in Phoenix. Welcome back to Square Off. So much to talk about. I do want to start with two breathtaking data points. The record-breaking spending in the races, the Republican primaries for governor and Senate. Karen Taylor Robson has spent $15 million of her own money. Jim Layman in the Senate race has spent $14 million of his own money, both unprecedented totals. Next closest isn't even close. And we haven't seen a single poll that puts them in the lead. We don't have the only poll that counts, and that's on Election Day. But Julie, what is the lesson here?
Well, I think the lesson is that sometimes even that much money can't buy you likability. I think that there are a number of voters who just are not happy with their choices. And so even with this much money, it may be getting them closer in the polls, as it looks like both of them are, this may be a close race, but it's not necessarily going to buy the entire election. I think it also, though, shows that some of these candidates had healthier leads to begin with, particularly in the governor's race with Kari Lake. I mean, she had come into our living room every night for many, many years, and so she had that huge lead to begin with. And it's hard to chip away at somebody that's had that much earned media over the course of her lifetime.
Is there a point at which money doesn't even matter anymore, Paul?
Well, Arizona hasn't been very kind to self-funded candidates in the past. Multimillionaires have tried to run in the past. Christine Jones, Buzz Mills, all with a lack of success. So this is actually continues sort of that pattern. The challenge is that the Republican primary electorate's a very narrow audience. It's not running for the general election. It's not trying to improve the overall popularity of an individual. It's a pretty narrow audience. And the challenge that they're actually facing is that while they've spent a lot of money, they're generally trying to do the same things that the frontrunner is. They're talking about immigration, they're talking about the election. Because it's so narrow, that it's a game of small margins, then you can't very gain much when you're talking about the same thing.
So the next dollar you spent really doesn't get you anything. I'll point out one irony. Matt Salmon several weeks ago was sitting in that chair before he jumped over to Karen Taylor Robson's side and said, you know what, I don't believe money can win elections in Arizona. And he jumps over to her side. Well, one irony there. Paul, you've tracked elections for years, and we've been talking for the last couple of years about a kind of a Trump-induced change in Republican voters' habits. And that's something we should be watching on election night. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Trump has completely, unequivocally changed Republican voting behavior. For years in Arizona, more than 2 decades, in fact, Republicans dominated early voting. They had brought it to the state, they perfected it, they used it quite effectively. And what we saw in early voting, the first couple of days of voting usually trended much older and much more Republican, and then it would trend younger and more Democratic over time. Republicans were basically trained to return their votes, which let those parties go out and contact other voters. When they banked the ones that they had, they could go out and get new ones. We're seeing a significant number of Republicans hold on to their ballots. It started in 2020 when they started to cast doubt in that election. We saw it in Georgia, and I might say that it probably impacted the outcome of the Georgia elections later in the year in 2020, and we're seeing that pattern continue again. It is a fundamental change in Republican voting behavior brought about by the president and some of his conspiracies.
And it's so interesting. I think we talked about some of that with Bill Gates, but it seems Republican voters are getting mixed messages from their candidates and from people like Kelly Ward about the election. The election, the election might be stolen, but put your ballot in the mail right now.
Right, or don't use mail-in ballot because it's a source of fraud. But by the way, put your ballot in the mail. Right. It is very confusing from the Republican side. On the Democratic side, I think they've been pretty consistent. They want you to vote early. They want you to use your mail-in ballot if you have it. They've also, you know, one of the trends that I've noticed on the Democratic side is they've gotten better at that messaging. They've become much more upfront when they're at the door saying, put your ballot in the mail, go ahead, vote now. And they also let you know that, you know, the longer you hold on to the ballot, the more contact that you're going to get from those candidates.
So please stop. Please stop.
And that's the irony of just that we talked about, oh, this election might drag on, or there might be fraud, or it might take longer to calculate the ballots. Republicans are purporting that. They are, if you drop off your ballot on election day, it won't be opened and counted on election day if you drop it in one of those drop boxes. If you vote, that will happen if you run it through the machine. But you know, we have a history of elections taking a little bit longer because of the number of people who drop off their ballots. So it's just an opportunity for them. They're bringing it upon themselves, but then they're going to claim fraud later.
So they're contributing to the election taking longer. And an important point, if folks are watching the election results on Tuesday night, the first vote dump comes in at 8 p.m., it might be possible in close races we're going to be waiting until Wednesday or Thursday for results.
Absolutely.
And it's not because of any funny business, it's just voter behavior.
That's just because they have to open the envelopes, they have to verify them, and then count them.
Let's drill down on the races now, because I do want to get your predictions at some point here as we chat. Julie, I know we're talking about the Republican primary, but that's frankly where a lot of the action is. What's your biggest takeaway from this primary and how it's changed from past years?
Oh, goodness. Well, a couple of things. I think for me, it's the issues, right? I've never seen a primary where we're still talking about the past election, where that's the number one issue, particularly, well, not just on the Republican side, on the Democratic side as well, where the issue is, do you want to save democracy? And who's going to be the hardest to work to save democracy, to ensure that we don't let anybody, you know, overturn the will of the people? That's become obviously a huge issue. And then there's also abortion. Who would have thought that abortion would be such a big issue? I don't think we're seeing it as much in the primary because we don't have as many contested Democratic races, but that is going to be the issue that we are going to see over and over in the general. Democrats are going to make sure that they talk about it.
And Paul, is this a watershed moment for the Arizona Republican Party? I hear folks calling it the Arizona First Party, but isn't it really the Trump First Party? And you see Trump versus Ducey, Pence, the establishment. Is this kind of the confrontation to end all confrontations?
Never did I think a former president of the United States would call another Republican a rhino, a Republican in name only. I didn't think we would ever actually see that. And apparently the definition of rhino simply means if you support President Trump or not. That's the only, so they become synonymous. So we've had several watershed moments like this. I think this is probably the most exacerbated version of it because you see a concentrated effort among Republicans to attack other Republicans in some of these down ballot races in particular. And you have outside groups like Turning Point and others who have decided that they're going to take out some of these individuals, which is, you know, makes for some very delectable races for us consultants, but it makes it a very negative primary for everybody else.
You know, from my perspective, we're in a whole new world. This is my 9th cycle, and I'm still coming to grips with exactly where we are, you know, in our politics and really, honestly, as a country. Let's go to the Dem side. Katie Hobbs was the overwhelming favorite to win. Marco Lopez, who's been running for a year and a half, seems to have found his energy in the last few weeks. Is that race going to be close?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen the polling. I haven't really seen any polling since Aaron Lieberman dropped out. I think it, you know, definitely Marco has played on the fact that Katie just hasn't showed up to debates, and so people don't really know how she's going to do in debates, and he has gained a lot of momentum. You know, it's not over till it's over.
Okay.
And so I'll just say that.
Pretty sure that one's over. I mean, when you look at it, Katie Hobbs got a national reputation and a national fundraising presence from defending the election and being the Secretary of State. I don't think she needs to spend a lot of money right now. She has, I mean, if they saw Lopez gaining traction, I think they would do something about it. My suspicion is that they're holding on to as much money and as much relevance as possible for the general election. I think that might be a bit of a mistake because it's one of the things that Democrats do, that they wait till after the primary to start talking. The issue is that we have so much exposure to these Republicans right now that you're starting behind in the name ID contest.
All right, Republican primary for governor. Taylor Robeson, Kari Lake, who wins?
So I think what's going to happen is we're going to see on election night when the early ballots drop, those will probably favor Robeson. And then the election day voters, these folks that are afraid to show up because they're worried about the security of their ballot, tend to benefit Lake. So it really comes down to, does Robeson have a lead on election night that can withstand a Lake trend backwards? If Lake is leading on election night, I think she wins.
Okay, so let's enter a world where Kari Lake does win. And on August 3rd, Doug Ducey, Governor Doug Ducey, has a $10 million decision to make because as the Republican Governors Association chair, he booked $10 million in advertising for the Republican candidate months ago. Will Ducey spend that money on Kari Lake, who has trashed him nonstop? You're shaking your head.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I want to go to a soundbite about how Doug Ducey answered sort of a similar question when asked why he helped white nationalist Wendy Rogers get elected in 2020. Take a listen.
That's what I've wanted to do, is move my agenda forward. I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish, and she's still better than her opponent, Felicia French.
She's still better than her opponent. In other words, Doug Ducey saying Wendy Rogers is an R and still better than any D who could go up against her. As offensive as Wendy Rogers has been, censured by her own Senate colleagues for threats of violence against them, it appears Governor Jan Brewer has said she'd back Lake. Karen Taylor Robeson has said she'd back Lake. Will Governor Ducey back Lake in this election and put that money behind her?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, I'm pretty sure that the commercials are already produced. They're going to be anti-Katie Hobbs commercials. I don't think that they suddenly need to make pro-Kari Lake things. It's all in the bag. That's all planned. So do I think the RGA is going to attack Katie Hobbs? Likely. I think that their goal is to keep Republicans elected. And that is one of the things that sort of speaks to where a lot of these Republicans come from, is that at the end of the day, you have a hot contest and then you come out arm in arm and you back your opponent because they're a Republican. I don't know if Lake is built like that. I don't know if Lake were to lose, would she do that? Because she's already said she's going to claim fraud. And I'm not sure that those portions of the party are willing to do that. And that's the irony here, is that these Republicans, the establishment Republicans, are the ones that have sort of towed the line. They've also, by the way, been very successful in Arizona. You look at people like Ducey, Flake, the folks backing McCain. You know, Kari Lake speaks out against all of them, but all of those folks win statewide office. Last time around, Trump didn't.
Okay. Do you see Republicans, Doug Ducey, Jan Brewer, Karen Taylor Robeson, all locking arms with Kari Lake? Or I think, as you suggest, Paul, maybe just these ads will air. They don't have Doug Ducey's name on them other than the RGA paid for this.
Right.
How's that going to go down?
Well, I think they definitely will be more focused on attacking Katie Hobbs, without a doubt. I agree with Paul that those ads were made a long time ago, but I think there's something really important to take into account here. We've been hearing in the last few weeks, because you had Pence endorse one candidate, Trump endorse another, not just in Arizona, but in several states. And it's this talk about fighting for the soul of the party, to which I say, what soul? What soul? I mean, honestly, I think it's a very corrupted, immoral soul if that's what they're fighting for, because you don't see a difference between the Pence Republicans and the Trump Republicans when it comes to embracing white nationalism, when it comes to misogyny, when it comes to xenophobia. You just don't see a difference there. What you see a difference in is it seems that Pence and Ducey want at least a little bit of democracy, whereas the Lake and the Trump folks are all in on authoritarianism. Now, that is, I think, an important distinction between the two. But when it comes to morality, when it comes to policy, when it comes to those sorts of issues, they're locked together. And I really don't have any doubts that Doug Ducey will put the full force of not just the RGA, but himself behind Kari Lake.
All right, August 3rd. We'll be watching.